I'm getting better at the recording.
We haven't had to redo a lesson.
I know.
Months.
So today, I said last week it was the last week of Elijah, and I'm thinking today's the last week of Elijah, but sometimes
We say a lot of stuff.
that's right. So before we get started, there's 2 points. So we're studying Elijah, who of all the prophets, he is one of the, if not the most, well, he represents the prophets.
He's a bigwig.
He is a big wig, and he doesn't even have his own book. And remember, he, for a timeline, 900 years before Jesus came to this earth. And that'll come into play as we study this week. But there's 2 things we want to highlight before we get started. And one is, Scott does these things during the week, like he asks me a question and he always says, it's not that hard, but you know, it's sort of one of those trick questions. So this week is, what did Elijah do? And he just looks at me and he says, so what did Elijah do? And I'm supposed to come up with, I always think I'm supposed to come up with a big answer.
So first of all, asking questions is sort of a age-old way of teaching. But the point is, if we go to all this trouble of studying Elijah, don't you think it's a good idea to see what sort of the point of the whole thing was, the pinnacle? He was here for one big reason. There are a lot of things that he did, but it sort of reaches a peak. And I think most people would say Mount Carmel. But what about Mount Carmel? I mean, was his job to come and kill a bunch of priests of Baal? Is that really what it was about? Do you want to?
Well, and that isn't, and I did get to, you know, what did he do? And I said, the big showdown at Mount Carmel. And then Scott says, and so the and is, and I finally got there, I will tell you, but always sort of painful. He showed the Israelites that Yahweh was the one true God.
If you remember, after they saw that display, the Israelite people said, Yahweh is God. Yahweh is the God, actually. And they had been turned away. They turned away. Now, it's not somebody else's fault, but the leaders, the kings had moved the country in this direction that left the worship of Yahweh. And after seeing this display, they proclaimed, they realized, oh, well, you know, we've been wrong. That's sort of a big deal. That's not just sort of, it's exactly a big deal. And that's what was accomplished, this big showdown. So often, and I think because we a lot of the time get sermons, they're like little snippets. We see the Bible like a bunch of unrelated vignettes, just these disconnected stories. But you see what has happened to them. And then there's this big episode at Mount Carmel, and the people realize there is a God in Israel. Yahweh is God. And so that also becomes very important, because Elijah is mentioned numerous times, one more place in the Old Testament, but numerous times in the New Testament. And in that episode, and bringing those people back plays a big part.
So we're supposed to remember that, what was his purpose, or what was his mission. And the second thing is the purpose of prophecy. And we're going to talk about some prophecies in today's lesson. And I realize that sometimes the prophecies in the Bible, to me, sometimes become actually almost a stumbling block. They become a stumbling block because I don't want to read them. And then when you read that the prophecy came true, sometimes it looks like they're sticking a square peg in a round hole. And then there's theologians who have all these things that there's 2 parts of prophecies. What are they called? What are those things we read this week?
They're dual references.
Dual references. So a prophet makes a prophecy, and some of it comes true then, and some of it comes true later. But the ultimate purpose of prophecies, when we were talking about it this week,
I believe, and nowhere is there a rule book for me to refer to, but there's a place, actually there 2 times in the Gospels where it talks about how, Abraham believed and It goes through a whole list. I should actually have had it to read, but the point is that all of these people kept their faith. They believed, even though they didn't see the fruition of a lot of the things that we now know about. And yet they never lost their faith in God during that time. And these prophecies are, I believe, a little bit of reinforcement for that. Sometime in their lifetime, they saw a part of it. They were able to glimpse at least a piece of it, or maybe it's a parent or grandparent. But the prophecies, the plan lasts so long. And I've had, after reading a whole bunch of prophecies, this idea that people that get that view, time sort of doesn't mean the same thing. They often seem to you can't tell if it's a long prophecy, if there's a year in between, or a day in between, or 500 years in between the parts. And we tend to look at this world in terms of our own lifetime. So we see it, oh, well, 70, 80 years, as David says, is a lifetime. That's all that matters. And we see through the Bible this very, very long plan taking shape, and it's amazing. And so we get this prophecy that says, look, I'm going to give you a glimpse. You're never going to see it. You're not going to be here for all of it, but I'm going to give you a glimpse of what what happens in the long term. And as we're shown in those passages in, I think it's Matthew and Luke, that it sustained a lot of people, that it was enough. And the idea is to reassure us that we don't see the whole plan, but we have enough clues along the way. And it is a difficult thing. Now, what Mary said, and I'll mention this quickly, but if you ever have someone tell you this is a prophecy, it's okay to look at it and go, I don't see that. People stretch, some things and say that prophesies about this. And I look at it sometimes and I go, you would have to really work to make that connection. Don't feel bad if it strikes you that way. Don't feel like there must be something wrong with me because they seem so sure of themselves. People do that. That's the way they like to talk, is it? And we'll talk about the other when we get there. But anyway, that is a big thing to remember, because part of the rest of where Elijah gets mentioned is in prophecy type things. And he factors large. He was a big deal, largely because what he did, his mission, was to bring the people back to God.
So we're at the end of Elijah's life, and remember, he has appointed Elisha to take his place, and we're on 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. Shortly before the Lord took Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel. But Elisha replied, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets of Bethel came out to Elisha and said, do you know that the Lord will take your master away from you today? Yes, I know, he replied. Do not speak of it.
Can we interrupt right here?
Mm-hmm.
So here's this interesting, to me at least, Elijah has been given to understand that it's his time. He's about to leave this world, and he's going to visit a couple of these, I don't know what to call them except prophet schools, which seems odd, but they do. They train these people who are known as prophets, and he's going to one of them, and it's almost like he doesn't know if he might be called away any moment. And what you see in it is he's sort of trying to put some distance between himself and his apprentice, his successor, Elisha. And he says, look, you wait here. I'm going to go down and talk to these people. And his apprentice, Elisha, says, I'm not leaving you. There's no way I'm going to leave you on a day like this. And some of the prophets come to where Elisha is and said, your master's leaving today. And Elisha says, yeah, I know, we aren't going to talk about it. But what struck me as funny, can you imagine how difficult it must be to try and hide something from a school of prophets? They know what's going on, and Elisha does. But this idea of, yeah, I know, but we're not going to talk about it, is so human. I love these places where we get to see that these people are people. And he says, yeah, I don't want to talk about it, right? So.
And Elijah said to Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho. But Elisha replied, as surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went to Jericho. Then the sons of the prophets of Jericho came up to Elisha and said, do you know that the Lord will take your master away from you today? Yes, I know, he replied. Do not speak of it. And Elijah said to Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me on to Jordan. But Elijah replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So the two of them went on. Then a company of 50 of the sons of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing Elijah and Elisha, as the two of them stood by the Jordan. And Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the waters, which parted to the right and to the left, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. After they crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken away from you? Please let me inherit a double portion of your spirit, Elisha replied. You have requested a difficult thing, said Elijah. Nevertheless, if you see me as I am taken from you, it will be yours. But if not, then it will not be so. So they were walking along and talking together. Suddenly a chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elisha went up into heaven in a whirlwind.
Let's stop there. So this thing sort of gets repeated. Everybody knows what's going on today, but we're not talking about it. If that's not human, I don't know what is. The other prophets aren't in on the game, and they keep coming up and saying, your master's getting taken today. And Elisha keeps saying, yeah, just let it be. But what he is saying is, I'm not leaving you. Okay, I know this is about to happen, and I will not leave your side. I will be there. And Elijah is trying to, I think, spare his apprentice and successor. And he's, he keeps telling him, you wait over here. And he says, it's not happening. I'm not leaving you. And so then we get to this point of, they get to the Jordan, and Elijah does, it's a strange thing that he wants to get to the other side. And so he rolls up his cloak, strikes the water, and it's parted. And this is one of those miraculous things that we see that always strain us a little bit. But all of these other prophets see it. These kind of things become reinforcement. They're the prophets that are going to be teaching Israel. They see this happen. And it becomes reinforcement in later years. But they get to the other side, and Elijah says, what can I do for you? What can I give you as a sort of a parting blessing? And Elijah does something, or Elisha, that's hard to do. He does something that's very reminiscent of Solomon. You remember Solomon gets asked by God, what is it? You're going to be the next ruler. What blessing do you want? And Solomon says, I want wisdom to rule the people, to rule your people, actually. And he asked for this thing, and it's granted to him. And we know that story pretty well after the study we did. But what Elisha says, he's just watched him part a river. He says, I want a double portion of your spirit. And this is another thing. I love the way this goes, is Elijah doesn't just jump and say, okie dokie, that's, because he says what you've asked for is difficult. And I get the impression he's saying it's not exactly mine to give. It's not my spirit that you're asking for. This comes from God. He says, but instead, what I'm going to do is tell you that if it's God's plan, if it's his will, then when I'm taken, if you're there to witness it, you'll get what you just asked for. If you don't witness it, it wasn't meant to be. That's not God's will. And that's an interesting way of handling something like this. I've been intrigued with that. But then it comes, the two are walking down the road, and it says this fiery chariot comes and splits the two of them apart. I mentioned last week, every Sunday school class I was in as a kid, all these posters and stuff show Elijah going up to heaven on a fiery chariot. And it doesn't say that. And what happened this week?
I was reading another sermon and to find out about Elijah in the New Testament, and they said, and it was a long theologian, and he says, and Elijah got onto the chariot and went up to heaven. And I'm like, no, dude, that's how it says.
It's not that hard to read. Now, it does say that he's taken up, but first let's talk about the fiery chariot. And I talk about this sort of thing from time to time. I think that it would not have made sense for Elisha to have seen a 70 Ford station wagon come and separate the two of them, right? I mean, they see, we see what we're able to see. And if you see something that you can't explain in someone else, you're wanting to tell them, you're going to have to put it in terms as best you can. When cars came out, people called them horseless carriages, right? That's the best they could do. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. So it's sort of a carriage, but there's no horse pulling it. Does that make sense? And the people literally, I mean, I've read these stories, the people kind of said, no, not until they see one, not so much. It doesn't make sense. So what we're told is a fiery chariot. Do I know? I mean, do I think that God is limited to using chariots because that happens to be the conveyance of the time? I really don't believe that. Could it be? I don't know. I don't really care. But what's described, I would say, don't get too hung up on the idea that it's an actual chariot of fire. I don't know. What they're telling us is that Elisha is walking down the road right next to Elijah, and the two of them are separated. It's time. Elijah is being taken. He's being called, if you like that. I like it better, but he's been called. And for some reason, this man is not going to see death in the normal way. God takes him, but he separates the two of them as it seems to be somewhat, necessary. And that's what happens, is that this fiery chariot, for lack of anything better, separates the two of them, and then Elijah is literally taken. Now, do I think that heaven is up? And I really think that these are the things we do our best to understand. And so that's how we see something, and that's how it gets interpreted. But Elijah is taken by God. We're told one other person, Enoch, that he was no more. God took him. This happens twice that we know of, and they become significant. So, my point is, I would focus less on being taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot than about the fact that this prophet is for some reason is taken by God, and that his student doesn't want to leave his side. So God provides a method to separate the two of them because it's Elijah's time.
As Elijah watched, he cried out, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. And he saw Elijah no more. So taking hold of his own clothes, he tore them in two. Elisha also picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He asked. And when he had struck the waters, they parted to the right and to the left, and Elisha crossed over. When the sons of the prophets who were facing him from Jericho saw what had happened, they said, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And they went to meet him and bowed down to the ground before him. Look now, they said to Elisha, we, your servants, have 50 valiant men. Please let them go and search for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has taken him up and put him on one of the mountains or in one of the valleys. Do not send them, Elisha replied. But when they pressed him to the point of embarrassment, he said, send them. And they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days, but did not find Elijah. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, didn't I tell you not to go?
Once again, it's silly and it's people and it's all those things. They were watching when this happened as well from across the river. And they Elisha come back and part the river. And it's a sign, it's a message to them that this is God's prophet. I mean, this is yet another anointed, powerful person directly from Yahweh that's going to follow Elisha the rest of the time that he's doing his prophet work. But then they tell him they've seen Elijah go, and they go, maybe God made a mistake. Maybe this was just a normal whirlwind and he got pulled up. Let us send these men out to go look for him. Maybe he's just been dumped on a mountaintop somewhere. And it sounds ridiculous to us, but I don't think it's that out of character. There's another place we're going to come to where Peter does something similarly foolish. But let us send him. And Elisha knows better. He says, don't send people out to look for him. That's not what happened here. And they just pushed and pushed and pushed until finally he says, fine, send them, go ahead. You're not going to find him, but send them. And they do, and they look for 3 days, all of the logical places where Elijah might be, might have accidentally been dumped, and they don't find anything. And he said, didn't I tell you not to go? Didn't I tell you not to send these people? This is another one of those very curious things, though, that shows us, hopefully, the nature of being human. And maybe occasionally we see ourselves. I think it's a pretty good lesson. We do some kind of dumb things too.
So at the very beginning, I told you that one of the reasons I wanted to study Elijah is because the story of Elijah appears, or the reference to Elijah appears 23 times in the Bible, 7 times in the Old Testament, and actually 16 times in the New Testament. And so, when we started this, there are numerous Christian churches right now that consider themselves New Testament Christians. And when you talk to them, they say, the Old Testament, we're not under the Old Testament anymore, so we don't need to study that. And they only study the New Testament. And I was telling Scott, if you didn't understand what we now understand about Elijah, and you see the references to Elijah in the New Testament, you're going to miss something. I mean, how can 23 times he appears, Jesus talks about him, John the Baptist talks about him, the letters talk about him. And if we miss that, we miss the picture. So now with that background, we're going to jump to the New Testament. We'll jump one more time back to the Old Testament at the end, but I'm going to go to the New Testament, and we're going to look at the parallelisms, if that's a word, between John the Baptist and Elijah. And the first way to look at it, if you turn to Luke 1, and I'm going to read from verse 13 to 18. And if you remember Luke 1, what is happening here is the angel Gabriel is going to Zechariah, and Zechariah is John the Baptist's father. And remember, Zechariah was a high priest, and he and his wife were too old to have kids, and they told Gabriel says, your wife is going to have a kid, and Zechariah questioned him, so Zechariah could not speak until after John was born. And in this discussion, this is the angel talking to Zechariah. He says, but the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah, because your prayer has been heard. Your wife, Elizabeth, will bear you a son, and you will give him the name John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice in his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He shall never take wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. Many of the sons of Israel will turn back to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. How will I be sure of this? Zechariah asked the angel. I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years.
And then you might as well not spare the next line. It's when I just love this line. Zechariah says, how can I be sure of this? How can I know it's true? I'm an old man. I'm way too old to be having a child, and my wife surely is. And Gabriel, the angel, that means God is my strength. When you see something that ends in L, that means God. And so it means Gabriel, my strength is Yahweh, or is God. He says, I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God. And you're questioning me? That he doesn't say that part, but that's what that means. How can I be sure of it? And he says, because I said so. Enough. And of course, then he's told he won't be able to speak. But you want to talk about this, this section, or you want me to?
No, you can talk about it.
The big thing that we're doing this for is because there's a mention there that this John the Baptizer, I hate to say Baptist, he was not the origin of a denomination, but John the Baptizer was such a big deal. And he says, this son of yours is going to be a mighty man of God, and he will go in the spirit and power of Elijah. He is going to have a powerful mission here, if you will. All right. It doesn't say that he is Elijah. He says he'll go in the spirit and power. And I'll give you a little preview, because there are a lot of people who say he actually was Elijah. He's not. And this first reference tells you the spirit and power of Elijah.
So the second thing we're going to read is in Matthew.
Oh, you know what I would probably say?
Yes.
Remember when we started this talking about what did Elijah do? And he turned people back to God.
That was his
That's
mission.
the nature of repentance, is to turn. That's what it means, to turn from one thing to another. His job was to turn people and to prepare the way for the Messiah. And you look back at Elijah, that's why we brought that up at the beginning. That's what Elijah did, was he was there to turn the hearts of the people back to Yahweh. There's your parallel. Besides the fact that they looked an awful lot, these camel hair cloaks and the leather belt around the waist. It's the mission and spirit of Elijah that John the Baptist echoes.
And we're going to go to Matthew 11, verses 2 through 14. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Meanwhile, John, this is John the Baptist, heard in prison about the works of Christ, and he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who has come, or should we look for someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the one who does not fall away on account of me. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. And Scott always says that Jesus preaches forward, but he
talks in this direction, but he's teaching in that direction. These 12 particularly, most of the time, or a lot of the time, winds up being a teaching for them. He prepares them because they're the ones who are going to carry the word of this out after he's sacrificed himself. And so he's preparing them, and that's what he's doing here.
What did you go out to the wilderness to see? A reed swaying in the wind? Otherwise, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? Look, those who wear fine clothes are found in king's palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one whom it is written, behold, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has risen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet, even the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, and the violent lay claim to it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who has come.
Who was to come.
He was to come.
So we skipped. I don't like to skip around so much, but we both thought if we jumped into this, this is a direct reference to something from the Old Testament, and it gets misused and abused. And we decided to go forward, and then we'll go back to the actual prophecy back in Malachi. But what happens here, some of John's people come to say, John sent us. He wants to know if you're the one, if you're the Messiah, or should he wait for another? And instead of just saying yes, he does a thing. He says, go back to John and tell him what you've seen. What have you witnessed with your own eyes? The lame walk, the blind have sight, and the good news is taught to the poor, to the people who've been left out. Go back and tell him that, and he'll know the answer. But then he turns to talk, and he says, because this is about John. John is in jail now. But he asks him, he says, when you guys left the cities, remember people came out of the cities in droves to see John and to be baptized. He says, what did you come out expecting to see? A reed blowing in the wind? Did you just come out for some nature? Was a nature hike and you happened on this guy? He says, no. Okay. Did you come out to see a man dressed in fine clothes? Because John clearly was not that. And he says, no, you already know that men dressed in fine clothes are all in the cities. You came out for something. What was it? A prophet? He says, yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. He is the one about whom it was written, behold, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. This is a direct quote from Malachi. And we tell you periodically that.
And if you have your Bible, because if you turn to Malachi, which is the last book in the Old Testament.
Let's finish with this,
Okay.
because otherwise we're all over the place. But Malachi has prophesied of something, and Jesus is quoting it. This is red letter stuff. This is an exact word delivered by Jesus himself. So when he says this quote way back here in Malachi is about John the Baptizer, I think we should pay attention to it, don't you? I mean, doesn't that seem like a fairly wise thing? And yet you have all these theologians saying it means something else. And that's where that law of dual reference, well, it is this, but it's also this other thing. Let's just look at that. But he quotes from Malachi, and he says that of people born of woman, no one is greater than this John who you already know about. And yet, even the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And this is one of those, it's not exactly a prophecy, but this is another one of those things that people get told that help us to understand that there's more to this place than meets the eye. And this idea that, there is a kingdom of heaven. And even the least in the kingdom of heaven, it is a greater place than this. And even the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. And he's a sort of a big deal. So there's an incredible teaching going on here for the people, but also for his disciples. But then he goes on to talk about this one that would come to prepare the way. It's a quote from Malachi. So now that you know that, now that you know what Jesus said, let's go back and look at Malachi.
So Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament, and it's believed it was written in 400 BC. So once again, I like dates. So we've got Elijah born living in 900 BC. So 500 years later, in 400 BC, is when Malachi is believed to prophesize here. And it's the last book, and people say then there was 400 years of silence before Jesus came. So this idea of us always waiting for things, these people had to wait a lot longer than we're willing to wait. I mean,
our country is what, 250 years old? It was 400 years between the last of this books in our Old Testament and when Jesus comes. 400 years, our country is 250. We tend to see things in a very compressed time frame.
So if you go back to Malachi is only 4 chapters long. And at the beginning of chapter 3, it says, as Scott just quoted, that exact quote, "Behold, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. See, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts."
We should do Malachi sometime. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, but he says, I'm going to send my messenger ahead. And it's going to be he says, ahead of the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. So this is clearly prophecy, because he says, I will send, it's in the future. But what he says, the exact words he uses, behold, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. And Jesus uses that talking about John the Baptizer, those words. So again, people want to, they change this, and we're going to talk about how they do it. But it's pretty clear that Jesus said that this John is exactly the person being talked about in Malachi. And now comes the important part.
Now you go to Malachi 4, verses 4-6, the last 2 verses of the book of Malachi. "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and ordinances I commanded him for all Israel at Horeb. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. Otherwise, I will come and strike the land with a curse."
So remember the law of my servant Moses. This is the last words in the Old Testament. This is the last, there are no paragraphs. These are the last 2 paragraphs, right? Remember the law of my servant Moses and the statutes and ordinances I commanded him for all Israel. And it's not for everybody. There's still people who say, well, we still live under the law. No, we don't live under the law. And it even, we're saying this was for Israel. And he's telling the people of Israel, remember that. But then he says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And there are people who take that and say that Elijah will, I don't know, be reincarnated. And we see
or that John is the reincarnation of Elijah.
That John is the reincarnation of Elijah. And we see the angel Gabriel saying that he is there in the spirit and power of Elijah. And we see Jesus saying that this reference from Malachi is about John. That's what it was about. That's enough evidence for me that I don't need to go looking for reincarnation or whatever else about this. He is someone who comes with the same sort of spirit and the same mission to turn the hearts of the people back to Yahweh. And he's there, John comes to prepare the way of the Lord. And it's a beautiful thing. It is a prophecy that is fulfilled in a very, very clear way. And the only reason I'm making such a big deal is some of you may wind up reading someone say, well, you know, John the Baptist really was Elijah. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. And we're told that. We're absolutely told that he's not, but he has that spirit and power, and his mission is the same. John the Baptizer comes to prepare people for the coming of the Messiah. Ultimately, as we've talked about, the Messiah comes through Israel. They're the chosen people. They've been chosen to be the lineage of Jesus when he shows up. If they fall away completely, that becomes sort of problematic. And so Elijah comes and turns the hearts back. He gives this incredible display, and the people say, oh, that's Yahweh is God. This is an old plan, folks. This thing has been going on for a long, long time. And if you believe any of it, then you have to look at this and go, wow, I mean, that's what's happened here.
And just to finish up that thought that John is not the reincarnation of Elijah, in John, the book, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, when chapter 1, verse 19. And this was John's testimony when the Jews of Israel sent priests and Levites to ask him, who are you? He did not refuse to confess, but openly declared, I am not the Christ. Then who are you? Are you Elijah? He says, I am not. Are you a prophet? He answered, no. Then they said to him, who are you? We need an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, I am the voice of the one calling in the wilderness, make straight the way for the Lord.
It's a beautiful thing. This has been prophesied. I'm here to make I'm the one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. I am setting things up, turning the hearts to have them ready for the Messiah when he declares himself. And he quotes Isaiah, who's one of the other, prophets that really gives some amazing forward-looking prophecies. Which I guess I should talk about that. We read that verse where Jesus is saying, up until now, everything else was prophecy. Everything else was looking forward to this moment. Now it's about the here and now. Now I'm here. There's no secrets in this. There's nothing being, that forces us to sort of, think, well, is that what he really means? I mean, this is really clear stuff. Make straight of the way of the Lord. John himself says, that's who I am. They ask him, are you Elijah? And he says, yeah, no, I'm not. I'm not Elijah. I'm doing some very similar function. His dad was told the power and spirit of Elijah. So for what it's worth, he's not Elijah. No matter if you ever read or hear somebody say that he is, he isn't. And that comes up. There's two other places. One I'm just going to mention, Revelation. And I've got a few people bugging us to do Revelation.
Revelation chapter 11, and it's called the two witnesses. And it says, then this is John, and John saying, then I was given a measuring rod like a staff and was told, go and measure the temple. Oh, no, that's not where it is. It talks about, there's a reference in Revelations 11 that says the two witnesses, and there's these two witnesses, and it never says who these witnesses are. People believe they are Elijah and Enoch.
Remember the other one that it said he was just taken, he was no more? And I guess they assumed that they were taken so that God could use them in some future time in Revelation. I don't know, as if this is a limitation that God has. But it's all very strange.
All it
never-
says is 2 witnesses.
2 witnesses, and they conclude that one of them is Elijah. And so what that says is, well, if we believe that, what does that say about John the Baptizer? Because remember, he says, so that's where the law of dual reference comes up. Well, it is John, but it's not. It's John and it's this other thing that happens in Revelation. It's just silly. I don't understand. It's the same people who tell you that Elijah was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot and he stepped on and flew off. It doesn't say that. So one last reference to Elijah.
Yes, we're going to talk about the transfiguration, which is another one of those things in the New Testament that is right up there with Jonah and the whale, which isn't a whale, a fish. Okay, so we're on in Mark. And so transfiguration is a story that is in 3 of the 4 gospels. It is in all the synoptic gospels, and the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to read the situation of the story of transfiguration in the book of Mark, and it's Mark chapter 9. Then Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God arrive with power." After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. Want to stop there for a second? Those are his.
That's sort of the inner circle, and that came up with me this week. How do we explain the fact that certain people are just closer to us than others? Everybody's important, right? And yet we see evidence of, Jesus doing this. John calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. You don't explain it, it just is. But he takes this sort of inner circle, these 3, to Mount Horeb.
And led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became radiantly white, brighter than any launderer on earth could bleach them. And Elijah and Moses appeared before them, talking with Jesus.
So here we are. This is this strange thing. He takes him up on a mountain, and suddenly he changes and he is glowing. Well, we have a similar description when Moses comes back from Sinai. It's not unprecedented. Can I tell you exactly what happened that make this? No, it's something being in the presence, the very presence of God. Maybe, I don't know, but something happens. He is transfigured, he is changed. And these 3 see it. And I'll do the next one for you, because he says, don't tell anybody about this until after after the Son of Man is resurrected. It's understood by then he's talking about himself. He is on his way to Jerusalem to sacrifice himself. So this is another don't tell anybody, it's going to be misunderstood.
So with him on this mountain are Elijah and Moses. Now we know Elijah was during 900 BC. Just to refresh everybody's memory, Moses was from 1400 BC. So we've got 1400 BC, 900 BC, and we're in the 30s AD.
We have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
We'll break. Go ahead.
Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." For they were all so terrified that Peter did not know what to say.
Peter, this is the one I referred to earlier. If these prophets do something kind of silly, Peter's up there, he sees these 3 glowing figures, the shape of men, and he decides, it tells us he's just overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. So he thinks to himself, you know what these 3 glowing guys probably need is a tent. We'll put up a tent for them. That's what they need. And it's just, this is another one of those cases where we're shown something silly. And I'm convinced that those are in here for us to occasionally look at ourselves and go, oh yeah, I think that's probably what I just did, is something kind of dumb. And it's okay, it's part of it. They're the inner circle, and here one of them is saying, I'm going to put up a tent for the 3 glowing guys.
Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my beloved son, listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them except Jesus.
So this is the thing that confuses people. Why is this here? And why, here's Elijah. It says Elijah is with him
And Moses.
and Moses. And we don't get a straight explanation, but I'll tell you what we believe about it. Moses represents the law. If it's possible to be a living embodiment of the law, it's Moses.
He's a poster child. He brought down the 10 Commandments.
That's where it came from. And they always talk about the law and the prophets. Moses is the law. Elijah is the living embodiment of the prophets, in as much as it's possible to be that. The law, the prophets, and here's Jesus. And then there is this cloud and there's a voice, and the voice says, "This is my son, listen to him." In opposition to what? The law and the prophets. And it's kind of funny because at the wedding in Cana, when the waters turned to wine, Mary tells those servants, he said, "It's not my time yet." And she tells them, "This is my son, do what he says." And it's almost, word for word for this thing. But God tells in the presence of these three who will be the leaders, he says, the law, the prophets, this is my son, listen to him. And then the other two are gone. What does this mean about Elijah? I mean, there is more to this place than meets the eye. It was necessary, I think, for those three to see this, to understand what's being said. The law and the prophets had their day. This is the fulfillment of all of that. Listen to him. It's another beautiful thing. It really is. It seems confusing if you don't understand
Who Elijah was.
what they represent. Yeah.
As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus admonished them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this matter to themselves, discussing what it meant to rise from the dead. And they asked Jesus, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He replied, "Elijah does indeed come first, and he restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected? But I tell you that Elijah has indeed come, and they have done to him what they wish, just as it was written about him."
So here's the thing. Malachi says that Elijah has to come before the Messiah. And these guys are confused. They go, okay, why does, if this is all means this, why does it say Elijah has to come before the Messiah comes? And you're saying you're the Messiah. And he says, I don't want to tell you, Elijah did come, and he's already told them that was John. It doesn't mean Elijah himself is reincarnated. It is this one who comes ahead to turn the hearts of the people back to God. And he says, Elijah does come first. Well, why does it say that the Son of Man, the Messiah, is going to have to suffer and be beaten and everything? Does that make sense to you? Does that somehow make more sense? If you can't believe that this was John the Baptist, you aren't going to believe any of the rest of this. And then he finishes up with, and what was the last? Yeah, because it's time.
"But I tell you that Elijah has indeed come, and they have done to him whatever they wish, just as it was written about him."
And keep going.
That was it.
Anyway, there is the point. He's told them Elijah, the function, the spirit, the Elijah that was to come. They ask that other verse that we read. He is the Elijah, not Elijah, but the Elijah who was to come. You got him already. It's John. So we want to tie that together a little bit in case you run across this. Why do people tell us fairy tales? Why do they tell us stuff that's absolutely contradicted? And I'm probably going to make some of you upset, but a lot of the time they tell us fairy tales, these spectacular things, that way, then they ask for some money. This deal with Elijah is something, he is important both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you're going to understand why now. What's the element? The element is to tell people to repent and turn to the Lord. There's our message. You could sum Elijah up in that one thing.
And you can sum up this whole transfiguration in the message. This is my beloved said, listen to him.
Listen to him. The law and the prophets are not your thing anymore. We've moved to something new. Listen to him. Moses, Elijah are gone, and who's left is the Messiah.
Next week, we're going to turn back to the New Testament, and we are not to the to the New Testament, to the three smallest letters, which are
Titus, Philemon, and
Jude.
Jude.
So we're going to do a switch, and
They're little teeny tiny books, you know, you can flip a page and miss them. And yet I think you're going to find a lot of things very similar to the world you see around you right now. They deal with a lot of the things that we're dealing with. Thanks for being through this. And you know, I hope it doesn't get too wordy, but there's no way to do it too easily. God, we listen to these words, we hear this story, and the message continues to be repent, to turn away. You've told us that if the people called by your name will humble themselves and pray and turn, you'll heal their land. We need a healing in this land, and I'm not sure that the message can be overlooked, that repenting and turning back to you is key to that. I don't know what the plan is. I don't know if people will do that, or if this is a time where things just grow worse. But we, each of us, at least can remember this one message, to turn back to God, to turn from where we are back to you as often and as cleanly as possible. Be with us always in the week that we have ahead. Keep that message in front of us so that we can carry that grace and light that you give us to the rest of this world. Amen.
You guys can turn yourselves back on again, unmute yourselves. Good morning, Naya. Sorry if I didn't let you in right away. I was not looking towards it. It took a while. I don't know. I saw you up there all of a sudden. I'm like, sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you. No, thank you. Sorry I'm late. I head to mass first and then I get here when I get here.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
thank you.
No problem.
We don't suffer from formality here. So it's
Okay. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
well,
very much.
I hope you guys all have a good week.
Thank y'all.
Cindy,
Y'all
Thank
too.
you. You too.
Cindy, when is your trip?
yeah.
We leave next Sunday.
Next Sunday. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Oh,
So
shoot.
we won't be on next Sunday because we'll be on our way to Mexico.
That makes me more happy than I have words for. That is great. Enjoy.
I
Safe
know. Well,
travel.
and also that, we discovered a great orthopedic surgeon in Corpus, not in Houston, but in Corpus. So that's awesome.
That is very awesome.
Medical is not too good down there in Corpus.
Virginia, you have someone with you this morning?
Yes, that's Jeanette.
Ah, okay. Hi, Jeanette. Good to see you. You'd already,
She's in Oklahoma, Tulsa.
really? I'm sorry. No, that's just not right.
No, this is Jeanette came with me to France, and so she knows Kathy and Lori and
Oh, she went with her to France, yeah, and yeah. He
Yeah.
just went to go say goodbye to somebody that was walking out the door, because Alton isn't doing well either. Well, make sure you tell Lori on your way back that I
We will.
spent the evening with Kathy last night, so.
yeah, do that. We'll do
Okay, you
that.
guys have a good week.
All right.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Y'all have a
Safe
great